And our session is on Zeitenwende in Northeast Asia. Zeitenwende, of course, is an expression which was used by Chancellor Scholz of Germany several days after Russian invasion of Ukraine. So in this session, what we are going to do is, first of all, we have top-notch panelists. So I will just begin by introducing our panelists. So just next to me, sitting next to me, is Dr. Marcus Nolan. And then next to Dr. Nolan, we have Dr. Schneider, who is Director for Korea at another very prestigious institution in the United States, which is Council on Foreign Relations. And as you can see, he just stood up and bowed to you. He knows Korean culture so much, maybe better than me. And then next to Dr. Schneider, we have Professor Jia-Ching Kuo. And then Professor Jia-Ching Kuo is a professor of international relations at maybe the most prestigious university in China, which is Beijing, Beijing University in China. Last but not least, we have Prime Minister Carl Bildt coming from Sweden. And the first time I met with Prime Minister Carl Bildt, that was back in 1995. And this morning I was just half joking and told him he has not aged a bit, not a bit, since 1995. But anyhow, I'm so much honored and glad to share this session with these top-notch panelists. And with them, we are going to address three set of questions. First set of question, what in fact should be our understanding of Zeitenwende, or New Cold War? So that's the question I'm going to raise with the panelists. And there will be second set of questions, which is, how do we have to respond to those challenges? So they will be the second set of questions. And I've been working for the Korean government for decades, so I cannot share this habit, which is, what would be your recommendation to the Korean government? So there will be the three broad questions I'm going to raise with my panelists, and relax and enjoy our session. Thank you. So with respect to the first question, that is, say, understanding of Zeitenwende, let me start with Prime Minister Carl Bildt. Well, Mr. Prime Minister, as a matter of fact, Sweden as a country has been very proud about its neutrality. So even during World War II, somehow Sweden managed to manage its neutrality. And during more than 70 years of Cold War and post-Cold War period, again, Sweden could manage neutrality. But now, Sweden is shedding that neutrality and joining NATO. I'm pretty sure it must have something to do with your perception about the change in the international system. So could you share that perception with us?
Well, the big change is, of course, what happened in February 2022, when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine with the aim of conquering the entire country and essentially getting rid of it. This is something we haven't seen in Europe since really September of 1939, when Adolf Hitler did the same, suddenly attacking Poland with the same aim, getting rid of a Poland that he thought didn't have any right to exist as an independent nation. And this, of course, fundamentally upset the entire system of security and peace in Europe and caused all of the nations in different ways to reconsider their position. We've seen a major increase in defense spending. My own country, in the latest budget, increases defense spending by 30% in 1 year. We see that all over Europe. We see it notably in Germany. That is where the phrase Zeitenwende came from. We see the mobilization of political will in the European Union to support Ukraine, and from the Americans. The Americans have been slightly bigger in terms of the military support. Europeans have been bigger in terms of the financial support, which is equally important in order to be possible to defend Ukraine. If we look at the results so far, Russia has lost roughly 50% of what they conquered during the first month, but everyone is now bogged down after 600 days of war in a long-term war of attrition with no end of the war in sight and peace not going to be there for years to come. So it is a fundamentally changed security situation in Europe. It has global implication, and I think those we are going to deal with as well.
Well, Scott, let me turn to you. So, well, Prime Minister Bildt already said that, in the sense that, first of all, the impact of Ukrainian war, that in fact is a very serious challenge for all the European countries, but he already said it in fact has a global impact. So what, in your view, is its impact upon Northeast Asia?
Well, as the Prime Minister said, this was a remarkable event in which one country was trying to erase a line on the map and change international borders, and we haven't seen that for so many decades. But in Asia, I think that what that event does is it galvanizes fears about other forms of revisionism around contested lines. And there are two particular actors that have driven the focus of attention. One is North Korea, because the borderline between North and South Korea remains contested, and the other is the relationship between China and Taiwan. Because even though Taiwan has exercised its own government, the issue of its political relationship to Beijing remains very contested. And so I think that especially for South Korea and Japan, we saw an immediate response in terms of the application of sanctions following the February 24th invasion. And it has also had a lot of follow-on effects, especially related to how South Korea and Japan have tried to respond as supporting actors in an out-of-area conflict to Ukraine and Russia. So there was the application of sanctions against Russia. There was also the supply of assistance to Ukraine. That's particularly significant for South Korea because we've seen major armaments exports to countries near to Ukraine. And so that is a major change in terms of South Korea's own profile and engagement.
One of the things which you just mentioned is that, well, what happened in Ukraine, it certainly galvanized provocations in some of the actors in Northeast Asia, and I agree with that. And then again, getting back to this Vostochny meeting between Putin and then Kim Jong-un yesterday, then again, we do not know what has been promised from Putin to Kim Jong-un. But at the same time, one of the things which Putin said yesterday was this, which is that I invited Kim Jong-un to this place, that is to say Vostochny Space Center, in order to help North Korea in launching satellites. And I was flabbergasted to read that because, well, that in fact, that act of North Korea launching satellites, that in fact is an act which is specifically prohibited through UN Security Council resolutions. And who is Putin? He is president of Russia, one of the POM5 countries. And he says, I'm going to help North Korea to do something which is prohibited by Security Council resolution. But anyhow, violation of international law apart, that in fact, when it happens, and I have a strong suspicion that it may going to happen, what impact it will have upon North Korea's behavior in the days to come.
Well, I think that remains to be seen, but I think that what you're talking about is really the follow-on effect of the decision to use economic sanctions against Russia. And from a North Korean perspective, what that decision to mobilize sanctions against Russia did was actually to expand its options in the domain of the sanctioned, because North Korea had been the subject of UN Security Council sanctions for a long time, and it was isolated, and Russia and China were cooperating in imposing those sanctions on North Korea. But in this new environment, with Russia also being the object of sanctions, it presents new opportunities for North Korea. And I think that that's what we've been seeing. It was a logical, unintended consequence of the application of sanctions that is now gaining momentum. And you're pointing to a very complicated issue, the one that they seem to have focused on as related to assistance for satellites, because North Korea has long tried to justify its own missile development program as related to the right of peaceful development in space. And so I thought that it was very interesting that President Putin also framed his comments in the form of assisting in North Korea's efforts to go into space. Obviously, there are a lot of other more serious military implications as related to North Korean capabilities and other areas where Russia could cooperate with North Korea that might be more serious. But the satellite one, I think, was perhaps the one that was easiest for President Putin to provide a justification, even if it is a direct violation of the UN Security Council sanctions.
Right. So let me turn to Marcus. Marcus, when the Cold War ended in 1990, the Korea's per capita GDP was no more than $6,600. Well, by 2016, it in fact went up to $35,000. So economically, as well as otherwise, Korea in fact benefited enormously because of this end of the Cold War. But I think we will agree with me in the sense that it was not only Korea, in fact it was the whole world which benefited enormously because of the end of the Cold War, and then significant increase in the exchanges of trade, investment, technology, people, etc., etc. And then because of all these geopolitical changes we've been talking about so far, then of course it is having serious economic fallout upon those economic exchanges. So as an economist, what is your take of economic fallout of geopolitical changes on economic situation in the world?
Well, I guess I would frame it a little bit differently. If you go back to the early 1960s, South Korea had a per capita income lower than Bolivia or Mozambique.
Or even North Korea.
Yes, and then it had a period of roughly 40 years of very high growth, and at the end of that period, it had a per capita income higher than Greece or Portugal, and today it's got a per capita income on some measures higher than Japan. So I don't think it's the end of the Cold War that's the issue. I think actually we go back to the Cold War itself. The Canadian Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, I think, captured this very well in a speech, Chrystia Freeland, in a speech that she gave in Washington a little bit less than a year ago. She argued that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union's self-isolation allowed the United States and countries like South Korea and others to have their cake and eat it too. The United States could lead an open system in which it and other countries benefited without worrying about strengthening the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc because they had self-isolated. As Ron Klain observed in his session on Tuesday morning here, in the early 1990s, we made a bet that supporting the integration of China into the international economic system would have the effect of raising Chinese incomes and ultimately putting pressure on the Chinese political system to evolve in a way towards greater pluralism and tolerance. That bet has failed. So unlike the Cold War period, now we face a situation in which the openness of the system potentially strengthens our adversaries. And that requires a rethink of trade policies, industrial policies, and supply chains. And I think you see the Biden administration and others kind of groping towards a way to respond to the new situation it finds itself in. That's occurring against the backdrop of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the deterioration of US-China relations, and a decreasing attachment within the US political system to the multilateral system. that has, as you indicated in your early questions, sort of elicited a kind of endogenous response. Constructive on the part of South Korea and Japan and some other countries, but unconstructive in the case of North Korea, which has gone off in an unconstructive direction enabled by Russia and China. And I think a real turning point may come if and when there is a seventh nuclear test. In the United Nations Security Council today, China and Russia are effectively acting as North Korea's protectors. If there's a seventh nuclear test and the UN Security Council doesn't act, then I think we're going to be back to a world of the Proliferation Security Initiative, or PSI, a kind of coalition of the willing. And I would simply conclude by making the obvious observation that if North Korea thinks that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a sacred mission to, how was it put, maintain its territorial integrity or something like that?
Exactly.
Well, that of
Sacred struggle.
Yeah, sacred struggle. Well, that, of course, is a rationale for North Korea attacking South Korea.
Right, right. Thank you. Well, Professor Jia, you have been patient, and then I guess maybe you have something to say about what we've been hearing from all the three previous panelists.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a great honor to be here. Well, when we talk about big changes, I think first of all, it's the change of the balance of power in the world, especially between the white world and the rest of the world, the Western world and the rest of the world. In terms of GDP, that balance is changing very rapidly. And also, even in terms of military spending, it's also changing. So this is something that has not happened for the past hundreds of years. And of course, this change has broad implications. I think there is a lot of anxiety within the Western countries about this change because of the unpredictability and uncertainty that it involves. The second change is that the US is challenging the world order it has made and led for many years, both in terms of using force against other countries without UN authorization, the second Gulf War, the war against Grenada and occupation of Grenada and many other. Of course, the US is not claiming that these territories belong to the US, but unlike the Russians, but it's use of force without UN sanctions, and forging some kind of a coalition of willing as sort of an excuse to do that. And also the WTO, the U.S. has undermined the ordinary functions of the WTO by making sure that the arbitration court does not work, does not function. And also, multilateralism also is weakened on the part of the U.S. The U.S. is talking about forging alliances, bilateral, minilateral alliances to deal with global challenges, regional challenges, especially the rise of China as a challenge. Instead of working together with the rest of the world in a multilateral spirit. So this is a big change. And of course, the rise of China is a big challenge, a lot of uncertainties. So I think the Korean situation, the North Korea challenge is embedded in this big shift in the world.
Well, thank you, Professor Jia. Well, that in fact completes the discussion of the first set of questions. So let me just try to move on to the second set of questions, which is that, well, given what we have understood That is to say, the challenges we have identified through these, 4 panelists. The second set of questions would be what our response should be in response to this new set of challenges. So for that, let me again turn to Prime Minister Carl Bildt. Well, Prime Minister Bildt, the thing is, Sweden, in fact, has already decided to join NATO. And then, as you already pointed out, then, a lot of the neighboring countries of Ukraine, in fact, they are significantly increasing their defense spending. And on top of that, what do you think should be the appropriate response of Europe as well as the whole world in response to these newly defined changes in the international system?
Well, first from the diplomatic global angle, I think it is very important to try to mobilize as much support as we can for the fundamentals of the global order. And there are at least 2 things that we consider fairly fundamental. One is, of course, respect for the territorial integrity of nations. You are simply not allowed to endanger the territorial integrity or try to get rid of nations. And I was rather encouraged by the communique coming out of the G20 in Delhi the other day, where the principle of territorial integrity is very firmly established. China has its own particular reasons for being of that opinion, obviously, and I think that the fact that China has that opinion made it very difficult for Russia to oppose that particular language. That's important. Second principle is, of course, that you are not allowed to attack other countries. I mean, aggression is the prime crime. Go back to the Nuremberg trials against Germany after 1945, or the Tokyo trials against the Japanese, same time. The crime of aggression was considered the prime crime against international law, and they were actually sentenced their leaderships to the most supreme sentence that you could get for that particular crime. So territorial integrity and no to aggression. If we can mobilize the world to that, against that, that's important. In Europe, you mentioned sort of the expansion of NATO, or Sweden and Finland joining NATO, which are significant steps in the northern parts of Europe. An even more significant step will be the enlargement of the European Union, which is going to happen. It's going to take some time because the European Union is a complicated creation, but we are 27 members today. The Brits left a couple of years ago. They might regret that particular decision, by the way, but that's a separate issue. But we will now open up negotiations to make Ukraine and some others a member of the EU. That's going to take 5, 6, 7 years, something of that order. It's a very fundamental transformation of the political order of Europe, and will have long-term repercussions, needless to say. And is, I would say, one of the 2 preconditions for re-establishing some sort of peace in Europe. The inclusion of Ukraine in the European integration and security order is the one. The other one is obviously some sort of change in the Kremlin. There has to be Russia after Mr. Putin at some point in time, sooner rather than later, in my personal opinion, to put it very mildly.
But that will be up to the Russian people.
That will be up to the people immediately around him, I would say. I don't think the people as such has much of a say in Russia.
Well, Mr. Prime Minister, Dr. Nolan has something interesting in his intervention, which was, during the Cold War, then Soviet Union was imposing self-isolation from economic exchanges. So when it comes to the free world, they in fact could be further facilitating economic exchanges among them without fear of, by doing that, in a sense, strengthening the Soviet Union. But now that is not the case, because the barriers among economies have been so much lowered during the past 30, 40 years of post-Cold War period. So now, well, the change we are facing is that because of this geopolitical tension, then in fact, if we continue with this economic integration, that in fact would be, in a sense, somewhat strengthening the countries which are challenging territorial integrity, which are challenging the principle of non-aggression. So that, in fact, is a new challenge. And the reason why I say all of that is this, because I just carefully watch what Europeans say For example, with respect to Europe's relationship with China, and then I think Europeans are saying we should be adopting 3 different approaches: how to cooperate with China, how to compete with China, and then how to pursue systemic rivalry with China. And there should be a balance among the 3 different approaches. So where would be Sweden's balance in that approach among 3 different approaches?
Well, Sweden is part of the European Union, so our balance is part of the balance of the European Union. And that is, to some extent, or to a large extent, of course, dependent upon the policies of China. Systematic rivalry, as you say. I tend to be of the belief, fairly strong belief, by the way, that open societies and open economies long-term have the better possibilities of developing, both in economic and political terms. And I do think that when there was the opening up of China and opening up of the Indian economy and others as well, we should not forget that, there was an overall liberalization of economies around the world. That was to the benefit of everyone. What we've seen in China, of course, during the last few years has been sort of a turning back. That has been a negative from an international point of view. I shouldn't go too much into Chinese politics, but I would say it has not been to the advantage of the development of the Chinese economy either. We see that slowing down for a number of reasons. Part of that is a result of the policy choices that has been made. That has intensified the sort of comparative rivalry part of the policy. At the same time, as there is no doubt that we need to have intensified cooperation with China on issues like climate, to take the obvious one. Global health is another one. So there has to be all of those components, but also very much dependent upon where we see the policies of the Chinese leadership going.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Scott, let me turn to you. Well, Scott, we already talked about Putin-Kim meeting in Vostochny, and then U.S. government representative, spokespeople, they've been saying, well, this in fact is a deal among devils, and then when it actually happens, then of course the United States would be ready to come up with more actions to penalize this arms deal between Russia and North Korea. But what could be the additional actions? Because so far as the UN sanctions are concerned, then because of what Russia is expected to do, what China is expected to do, so it will be very difficult to expect that UN sanctions could be strengthened. So with that as a background, what else could be done by the United States in order to further penalize this deal among devils?
Well, I like your much more specific question much better than the universal question that I got previously. What's really interesting, in my view, about the North Korea-Russia summit meeting is that it was announced by the United States. And I think that that was an effort to try to name and shame North Korea-Russia cooperation. So that's one thing that I think the U.S. is trying to do, is to deter through active declaratory statements of opposition. But that also has its limits. There is a limit to, we can oppose, but what is the concrete retaliation? And as I look across the horizon, I think that maybe the closest thing to a response that we also see is actually embedded in the Camp David Summit again, the development of trilateral response. But that's complicated because what we see, what a lot of people have been focusing on in Northeast Asia, is the potential emergence of opposing blocs. I don't think that we're quite at the stage of blocs yet, but in the context of this major power rivalry, North Korea has been a very active, has taken active advantage to the extent that it can. And it's pretty clear that there is an opening for North Korea to do a little bit more. And so I'm not sure that we yet have a really effective response. I think that it's natural that the U.S. is going to oppose the Russian effort to try to gain additional material resources and munitions, no matter how desperate it might seem.
Mm-hmm. Well, Marcus, we already discussed about, say, economic fallout of geopolitical challenges. And one issue, which in fact is very much in the minds of private sector, is something called supply chain. And then this, new challenge we face in the supply chain, that I think is identified in the private sector as the biggest challenge, biggest economic fallout of geopolitical challenges. And I think US leaders already understand that. And I think that is the reason why, when it comes to IPEF in the Pacific Economic Framework, then United States, in fact, has been emphasizing implementation of IPEF, particularly in the area of supply chain. And then we already discussed about Camp David, and in the Camp David meeting, the three leaders of Korea, Japan, and United States, they agreed to something called early warning system with respect to supply chain, where they are helpful in the sense that, for the exchanges of information, they will be helpful. But other than that, what further measures could be taken in order to calm down this widespread concern in the private sector with respect to supply chain?
Well, I think if we step back and look at the U.S. system, historically, both of our major political parties had both pro-trade and protectionist wings. Over time, the Democrats became the more trade-skeptical party. But under Trump and the kind of Trumpification of the Republican Party, it has become highly protectionist. And the political consensus for open trade in the United States has collapsed. And although I would love to see it rebuilt, that is going to be a major political effort, and I don't see that on the horizon. And so we have a situation which, in a narrow sense, IPEF is a manifestation of, on the one hand, the need to do something, and the need to kind of reassure people in Asia that the United States remains committed to Asia in the economic sphere, but the president can't pass any legislation. So it's essentially trade policy via executive order. You can't spend any money, you can't change any laws, you can't offer market access, which is normally the kind of coin of the realm in trade negotiations. So knowing that you were going to ask me about IPEF and the supply chain, I made a very big sacrifice. And I hope everyone here really appreciates the fact that I skipped going to the gym this morning.
Is that right?
In order to spend my morning reading the 27 pages of the IPEF supply chain.
I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, and here's what I can tell you. It's basically a kind of hortatory document, you know, supporting good works. There are action plans, there's a crisis response network, there's inclusion, there's labor rights, they're not interfering with Maori people in New Zealand. But there's no real commitments. There's no way of binding any country
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And so I think, I mean, it's really easy to kind of dump on it like I've been doing, but I think if you step back, the analogy I would make is that IPEF in general, and the supply chain aspect in particular, is somewhat like the OECD in Paris. It's a talk shop, but it can be a useful talk shop. No, the OECD doesn't really do anything, but it's actually a useful organization. It's a place where countries, governments come together, they talk, they produce reports, they produce data. It establishes kind of some targets and norms, even though there's no enforceable provisions. And so I would say that, you know, it would, you know, the supply chain part of this is kind of analogous to the OECD. It establishes some mechanisms, establishes some ways of countries to get together and talk about these issues, establishes some norms, doesn't have any enforceable provisions.
Marcus, I used to work for the Korean government when Korean government joined the OECD back in 1996.
Yes.
So as a matter of fact, your high appreciation of OECD, that in fact comes as a very positive, say, appreciation of Korea's efforts to join the OECD. Thank you for that.
And it's even the case that the IPEF document refers to, and you'll probably know the exact wording, I can't remember it exactly, but it's the OECD's guidelines on the behavior or operation of multinational corporations
of course,
and human
right.
rights.
Of course.
It
right.
refers back to that. It refers back to the equivalent UN guidelines
Right.
or charter on that. So it fits into that kind of world. It is not the WTO. It's not
Okay.
a free trade agreement. It's not
Okay.
something that there's a binding commitment together with some kind of dispute settlement mechanism and enforcement.
Right, exactly. Well, Professor Jia, well, we had our discussion on the first set of questions, second set of questions, and then the overall impression which emerged from our discussions, initial discussions, is this, which is that, well, there definitely seems to be this process of action and reaction, in the sense that there is a perception of newly emerging challenges, and then in return to that, in response to that, then there are certain actions being taken in the free world, and then that, in fact, could be perceived as additional challenge for the countries on the other side of the spectrum. And then that, in fact, could be in fact, promoting this process of action and reaction. That's an image which came up in my mind as I was listening to these discussions among panelists. What would you say to that?
Well, first of all, I think all countries should reflect on their behavior and try to do things at home to make sure that they are facing their own problems, not blaming other countries for their own problems. This includes the US, includes China and other countries. Secondly, probably we should resist the populist pressures when we try to deal with other countries. Okay? You know, we have populist politicians blaming other countries for their own country's fault, rather than trying to fix the problems at home. And these people represent the extremist, ideological fundamentalists, and racists. Okay? We should resist their pressures. Okay? All countries. Okay? And also, we should also work, the kind-hearted people and pragmatists of all countries should work together. We should respect each other, especially on the question of sovereignty and territorial sovereignty. The core interest, we should respect each other. This is part of the international law, part of the UN Charter. Okay? And finally, we should work together on areas of shared interests and stakes. Climate change, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, and many other global and regional challenges. And on North Korea issue, I think our interest to work together. You can't deal with it unilaterally or bilaterally or trilaterally. You have to work to get every country, every major stakeholder involved. In this case, China is indispensable. It's in China's interest that North Korea does not have nuclear weapons. It's China's policy of non-proliferation. But the problem is, we have a lot of problems in our relationship with the US, and now it's very difficult to work together.
Thank you, Professor Jia. Well, when I was preparing for this session, I said to myself, I very much hope that we could finish among panelists and then try to leave some time for questions to come from the floor. And then today, when you have to deal with these top-notch panelists, that's very difficult to be done because there is so much that I wish to hear from them. So today, unfortunately, we don't have time for questions from the floor, but instead, would you join me in giving big applause to the top-notch panelists we had this morning?